John chapter number 11. I guess it's been a week since we studied this. We left off at the shortest verse in the Bible, verse number 35. That was where we left off. It's kind of in the middle of the account, but wasn't really any better place to break off the Bible study last week. But everybody knows what's going on. This is chapter number 11 is the account of the resurrection of Lazarus, the death of Lazarus, and then raising Lazarus from the grave. We're at the point now where Mary and Martha have already demonstrated their faith in the Lord. The Lord has already told everybody that and his disciples that Lazarus's sickness isn't meant to remove him from the world. It's not unto death, but it's for the glory of God, and that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. So there's some awesome things that are going to happen here. Back in chapter number 9, remember he gave sight to the blind. Now he's going to the degree of the miracle is going to be escalated. It's on a higher level now. Something tremendously wonderful is going to take place here. And so the Lord is dealing with Mary and Martha and with the loved ones and all those that mourn the death of Lazarus. It says in verse 34, he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said unto him, "Lord, come and see." And then the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. It's in 1 Thessalonians. There's also rejoice evermore, but this is shorter based upon the number of letters. So Jesus wept. Now, so this is it's a short verse, but it's got a lot of meaning to it. Let me say just a couple of things that it's not. I mean, this isn't the weeping of a powerless man that's weeping because he's unable to change the state of affairs. He's not weeping because he wishes things could be different. He's not weeping because he's just full of despair over what's happening. I think really, there's a lot of depth to this, and it's more than just this. But on the surface, mainly what it is the compassion of the Lord. This is an open evidence of His compassion for His people. We've kind of brought this out already, but there is this constant and unceasing enmity, you might say, that exists between Jesus Christ and sin and death, which came to the earth because of sin. But it's not in any way an even battle. It's not in any way the type of thing where there's an ebb and flow where one gets the upper hand and then the other does. So that's not why he's weeping, because just for a minute, he lost the upper hand, and death intruded where he didn't intend it to. It's nothing like that, but it does show the compassion of the Lord. It does show how his people are dear to him. Now, whether he's weeping because of what has happened to Lazarus, because Lazarus was probably pretty sick before he died, or whether he's weeping because of the grief of Mary and Martha and the others, which I tend to think is more likely. It's still, in either way, it's a sign of the Lord's compassion. In my Thompson's in the margin, it says divine sympathy. I guess that's as good a way to put it as any. Divine sympathy. They also mention Christ's humanity, but God, the Father in heaven, shows emotions. He's said to laugh in derision at the powers of the earth, and he's said to be pleased when his people do what he commands them. So the emotions aren't strictly for humans, but this does show the level of compassion, I think, that the Lord has for his people. Then said the Jews, "Behold how he loved him." So, maybe this is exactly the message that the Lord desires to get across here. well, he designed, again, that kind of, it makes the Lord finite in his intentions, and maybe his intentions don't exactly equal the results, and that's never the case. Whatever his intentions are, the results will exactly equal what he intends. But from the human perspective, this might be the response that the Lord intended. Behold how he loved him. He did love these weren't strangers. Remember, Lazarus was his friend, and Mary and Martha have both made noble confessions that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so they know him for who he is, and he knows them. And some of them said, could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Well, remember we told that the giving sight to the blind was a miracle reserved to the Lord. And that kind of, in some ways, identifies him as someone higher and better than even the prophets that went before. Then, if he is such a man, their conclusion is, or their logic goes this way: could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Now, they haven't got to the point where they say, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind raise the dead? But had he been here, certainly you would think he gave sight to the blind. He could have healed Lazarus. That's what they're thinking. I don't think they're yet crediting him with power over death. But that's exactly what the Lord has. Though they haven't got there yet, I think Mary and Martha both have already drawn that conclusion. But whether or not they see that power revealed here today, that's, of course, I think they're not certain of that. But this is a man that certainly, if he could give sight to the blind, he surely could have healed this sick man. Jesus, therefore, again, groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Now, again, the groaning could be a demonstration of compassion. It could also be, I really don't know. This is a bit of conjecture here, because I don't really know that you have much in the way of other references that to help to shed any more light on this. But groaning in himself, I'm not sure exactly. Again, it might still be part of that conflict between life and death. This could be conflict still that exists between the Son of God taking upon him flesh, and then walking this earth and encountering something that is the result of sin, and something which is at enmity with his character, which is life. And it's to me, it would almost be more a demonstration of the Lord's long-suffering. It's almost like death itself is trying his patience, because he's the one that is the master. He's the one that has the keys to death and hell, and he's the one that is the Lord, like we read last week. No matter where you go, David acknowledged that if you go into heaven, he's there. If you go into hell, he's there. He's the one that's Lord over all of these. And I didn't mention this last week, but we talked about the powers of hell. In the Old Testament, very often hell is just a reference to death. It's not. We're not saying that. Every time hell is referred to, I think in the Hebrew word is Sheol. Did I get that wrong? Maybe it's. I think in the Greek it's Gehenna, but somebody can look that up. But it's a reference to death, or the place of dead souls. It doesn't necessarily mean a place of eternal torment until you get into the New Testament, and that's primarily what it refers to there. Because in the when you see the story of Lazarus and the rich man, Lazarus is in Abraham's bosom, and we think this is what most scholars say, that paradise was then taken out of hell and taken into heaven. So at one point, the grave and hell and death are all pretty synonymous. So anyway, but this is the God that has rule over even this part of his creation. And there's a conflict there, and that might be the groaning. I don't know, but the groaning could just simply be more divine sympathy, more compassion towards his people, seeing all the ones that are grieving. So this is what it says. It said, Jesus therefore again groaning in himself cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Maybe even like a hole going down into the ground and a stone just over top of it. We always think of just something that you could, just kind of like a really fancy looking cave, or something that's clearly a cave and you come up to it and see a stone in front of it. But sometimes a cave just might be a hole in the wall. It may not even, and it's just, there probably were others around this area, and they were turned into sepulchres for the dead. It could even have been, a cave that's dug out in order to be a grave. Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone." Okay. So this would be, you'd be astonished if you was here and you saw. They thought he was just going there to grieve over the grave. They thought he, grieve over the dead Lazarus in the grave, to grieve maybe with Mary and Martha at the tomb. But when he gets there, he says, "Take ye away the stone." Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." Now, so then some will say, well, this might be Martha doubting the intentions or the power of the Lord. I kind of see it again the other way. Martha is making it plain that what is about to take place here, and if we do what you tell us to do, this man, Lazarus is clearly dead, and he, and it is true that by now he stinks. Been dead 4 days, and still yet, in other words, she's saying it's almost like, a few chapters back, was in chapter number 6, when Jesus feeds the 5,000. The Lord looks at Philip. He says, "When shall we buy bread that we may eat, that these may eat?" And this he said to prove him. It's almost like he's. This is what's going to take place here. This conversation between the Lord and Martha is going to prove him again. Philip answered, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them. And then Andrew said, "There's a lad here which has 5 barley loaves." They're not doubting the power of the Lord. I don't think they're almost like. It's almost like they're setting the stage for something to take place. Just observe how tremendous this is that's going to take place. The Lord's going to take 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he's going to feed 5,000. That's all we have. Let's get this out in the open. Let's make it plain that this is all. This is what he has to work with. And Martha's doing the same thing. Let's make this. Again, there could be a measure of doubt here as well. But the result of what she's saying is to make it plain that what the Lord does is not some trick, it's not some trivial thing, but there's a body in that grave that stinks. If we roll that stone away, you're going to smell it, and the proof is going to be there. So that's what Martha says. "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." Jesus saith unto her, "Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God?" Okay, so previously in the chapter, this is what Martha told the Lord. She said, "If thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." And then the Lord said, she said, "But I know that even now," this is why I say that Martha had a lot of faith, "whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee." Jesus said unto her, "Thy brother shall rise again." But Martha said unto him, "I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said unto her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this?" So the Lord said to her that, and then now he says, "Said not I not unto thee that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God." So even the dead can live if they're believers. And that could be a reference to the spirit and the soul continuing on into heaven after the body dies. It could be a reference to the resurrection, when even the body will be raised and made new. In this case, it's a reference to what the Lord's going to do in the instance, or in the case of Lazarus and his death. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me." So at this point, the Lord's the miracle has either already taken place as far as Lazarus being alive, or the Lord puts it in the present tense because it's as good as done. I thank thee that thou hast heard me, or I guess that'd be the past tense, that thou hast heard me. He's, again, and he didn't have to say it out loud, but again, it sets the stage. It makes it plain what's taking place here, so there can't be any confusion. He's praying to his Father. Remember, at the beginning of the chapter, he said the sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. So the Son is never glorified separately from the Father. The intention is that the Father will be glorified and the Son be glorified as a result of that. That's what he says here. I thank thee that thou hast heard me. The Father must be glorified, and the Son will be glorified as a result of that, because he hears the Son and acts on his behalf. And I knew that thou hearest me always, but because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. There's just a few days left before the Passover. I don't know, a few days, maybe a couple of months. I don't know. I didn't look up the chronology here, but it's not long now before the Lord's going to lay down his life. The degree to which he reveals himself to the world as the Son of God this might be the pinnacle of it up to this point. This might be what he's been building up to. And the Father always hears him, but he's saying these things out loud because of the people that stand by, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. There isn't any doubt. He's praying to God, and he's claiming God as his Father, and he's claiming to be the one sent to the earth, and his words reveal that. And when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. So the words that he says now, he says as one who's sent by the Father, and as one who intends to and will glorify the Father, and he will be glorified thereby, because he's glorified as the Son of God and the one who does the will of the Father. And what he says now, again, transcends anything that he's done up to this point. At least in an open fashion. We've got that. We can get into this. I don't know if I could spend all my time talking about this, but we've already mentioned the example of Jairus' daughter. And he says, the damsel arise. And got the example of the widow's son there in the city of Nain that he also raised. But both of those were, one was on his funeral bier, so he'd probably been dead for at least a matter of hours. I don't know how long it would take to do that, but the other one had just died and was still in her room. Here's one that's been in the grave for 4 days. And what he's doing here is just and it's in such an open fashion with all these folks gathered around right near the city of Jerusalem. I think both of the other instances were in Galilee. Here he is right near the city of Jerusalem. The Passover is upon him. We're not far off, and there's probably, there's a lot more spectators and a lot more to bear witness, and I think the Lord alludes to that when he says, because of the people which stand by, I said it. And then because of these people, he says, Lazarus, come forth. He wouldn't have to say it out loud. He could just have thought it. And it may even be what he's referring to in verse 42 when he says, because of the people which stand by, I said, what I'm going to say. Lazarus, come forth. And when he says, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, Lazarus might have already been restored to life at this point. I just hadn't come out yet. I don't know. But whatever the case, we know, whatever however the series of events plays out, we know that the Lord is in charge of it. And the end of it is, he says, Lazarus, come forth, and he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus says unto him, loose him and let him go. Now, I don't know entirely what this means. I read what commentators say about the customs of the Jews and things like that, and what the customs of the times of when these things were written. But when you read that, you got to remember we're 2,000 years removed, and if somebody tells you that the Jews' custom at that time was to wrap them so tightly that they couldn't even move, that's their opinion. It could be, but it could also be that they were just loosely wrapped and then just covered over with something. I don't know exactly, but whether he was restricted or not, he walked. He came out of there. That's what it says, he's bound hand and foot. I don't know how tight the bindings were, but he did. He came out with his grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin, which makes us think that he probably couldn't even have seen where he was going, but here he comes. Because the Lord calls him, he comes forth, and then the Lord says, loose him and let him go. I was reading what one commentator said. He said one of the differences you see here is that when Jesus Christ arose from the grave, he left his grave clothes behind because he wouldn't need them ever again. Lazarus brought his with him. He wasn't raised in an immortal body, and he would die again. So that's kind of just a little bit of a difference between the two. So, but it does say he that was dead. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this. What the whole idea of remember, the Lord's already said that he's asleep. Okay, if you go back and look at Jairus' daughter, the Lord tells when all those mourners are there, he says the damsel isn't dead but sleepeth. Okay, and here he says the same thing, that Lazarus sleeps, he's asleep, and his disciples say, well, that means that he must do well. And then the Lord says, no. And then he tells them plainly that he's dead. So I think really that's just whichever way you want to apply the words, it means the same thing. They're dead, but they're asleep, and that's just you might say a metaphor for death. And in this case, he truly was dead. There wasn't any doubt about it. There wasn't any doubt in the other instances either. But in this case, given the amount of time since he'd been buried, there wasn't any doubt about it. He's dead. He couldn't have. You might even about why it says his face was bound about with a napkin. Maybe they wrapped him so tight that he couldn't have breathed. Had he been alive, so he certainly must have been dead since he'd been buried and wrapped like that for 4 days. I never even thought about it that way. That might be one of the reasons why he came out of the grave dressed like that, because even as he came out, maybe the proof was right there that he couldn't have been alive before, because he couldn't have breathed or moved at all. I don't know, but it still is plain and it's obvious that he was dead. Now, so then the question comes: where was his spirit? I tend to think, you probably don't hear people talk about this too much. I've not really ever heard anybody speak on this very much, if at all. But I think that when Lazarus is dead, that in this case his spirit and soul were asleep. I have difficulty imagining that, like Paul said, that to be absent with the body, to be present with the Lord. I have difficulty imagining that that his spirit and soul ascended to be, went to paradise. That's almost unkind then to bring him back and put him in his body. I don't want to put it, we shouldn't use the word unkind. I started to say it's cruel, but we know the Lord can't be cruel either. Anyways, it's beyond almost comprehension that he could be in the presence, in Abraham's bosom and in the presence of God, and then put back in his body. So I tend to think that he was asleep. In the Old Testament, there's an example of Elijah raising there's a widow woman there too, wasn't it? Raised her son to life, but it doesn't say that he resurrected that lad. I think it just says that he revived. In fact, I think that's the same word that's used in the account when Elisha brings back to life the Shunammite woman's son. I think it says they revived. So this is what I see this as. We see this as him being revived. It's the spirit and soul were gone. They weren't in the body, but they weren't either they hadn't gone to their final abode as of yet. They hadn't entered paradise or heaven, but they were out of the body. So these are just some, we don't want to imagine that everybody when they die, that their spirit and soul goes somewhere for at least 4 days now before it goes into heaven, in case the Lord wants to restore life to them. I just think these are special circumstances. The Lord knows the bounds of our habitation. He knows where we're going to live, when we're going to live, how long we're going to live. So it's no difficult thing for the Lord then to determine some that He's going to they're going to die, but spirit and soul is just going to remain apart from the body for just a little while and then go back in. He can do that. He can make those exceptions. And I think that's what he does in this case. I didn't look all these. I mean, I should have wrote these down probably, but Luke gives us the example of both the widow woman and also Jairus, who received his daughter back to life. And I don't know if I can find it right now. Yeah, over in Luke chapter number 8, when the Lord brings back to life Jairus' daughter, he says in verse 52, he says, "Weep not, she is not dead, but sleepeth." And they laughed him to scorn, knowing that she was dead. And he put them all out, took her by the hand, and called, saying, "Maid, arise." And I think Mark's account is Talitha Cumi. And her spirit came again, and she rose straightway. Now, I looked it up. This is the only instance. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give an account of Jairus' daughter being restored to life. I think only Luke gives an account of the widow woman in Nain, of her son being restored. And then you have the account of Elijah, because I just read that today in my daily reading, towards the end of 1 Kings, like chapter 17 or 18, when he restores to life the widow woman's son. And then in 2 Kings, like chapter number 4, is when Elisha restores to life the son of the Shunammite woman. That's the examples that I looked up. Now I know Elisha, another person came back to life as a result of Elisha, because remember, after he was dead and buried, they got in a hurry and they buried somebody in Elisha's tomb. And as soon as the body dropped down and touched Elisha's bones, the man came back to life. And I forgot to look that one up. I don't know what terminology was used there. But on all the ones that I looked at, this is the only instance where you see it says her spirit came again. That's what it says right here. I think that's what happened to Lazarus. His spirit came again. Revived to me seems a better word than resurrected at this point, because I know the Lord says, "I am the resurrection and the life." But in this case, this is a kind of like a precursor to the resurrection, but it's not the resurrection. The Lord is the first fruits of the resurrection. I mention that often. That means he's the first to resurrect with a glorified body. And since he's not been buried yet, Lazarus can't claim this same resurrection, but he can claim to be revived. And it does mean, I think, that his spirit was gone. It was out of the body, but it came to him again. We can debate, I guess, back and forth where the spirit goes, but I don't think it went into paradise. I think it was held. And I think that's really what the Lord means when he says Lazarus sleepeth. It doesn't mean that all souls just sleep, like some cults teach today, that there is such a thing as soul sleep, because I don't think that exists, except in these special circumstances that we've just identified. So before those spirit and souls are taken to their final resting place, they're restored to their bodies, and then he'll live only to die again. So that's what the Lord says. So loose him and let him go. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. So here's a very good reason now, according to our human perceptions, to believe on this man. To believe that he is who he says he is, that his Father is in heaven, and that he is sent by the Father, and he does do the will of the Father. To do what he just did is a remarkable thing. They believed on him, but some of them went their ways to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. It's always like there's a bunch of tattletales here that just want to get the Lord in trouble. There are some that are just so hard-hearted. Well, all men are hard-hearted, but these men's heads, their minds haven't been changed, their hearts haven't been broken, and so they're going to they're even harder than normal, I think, because they're hardening them, and the devil is working to influence them, and they resist even such a vivid scene of the power of God. And they go to the Pharisees. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, "What do we? For this man doeth many miracles." Just a little while back he gave sight to the blind, and that caused us some problems. Now he's giving life to dead men. That's going to no doubt cause us further problems, because he's going to be, if this continues, he's just going to take our power away. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. So that's a remarkable thing. This is very damning to the chief priests and the Pharisees and this entire council, that they know that if they leave him alone, all men are going to believe on him, which should be their goal. You know, if they knew who he was, they should want men to believe on him, but they don't want to give him, they don't want to acknowledge him as the Christ. And yet, even though others believe him to be the Christ, they're going out of their way to stop them. This is like when I have to go back and look this up, but like when the Lord said that the Pharisees, that they, well, how does the verse go? But they prevent even those that are entering the kingdom of heaven. Those that are entering in, you prevent them. You know, so even the ones that are believing here now, the Pharisees want to stop them from even believing on this man. They'll do everything they can to do so. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, "You know nothing at all." I'm going to try to get through the rest of this chapter, so I'll be real quick with these. So this is Caiaphas, the high priest. We find out, as you're going over here in the Gospel of John, Annas was also the high priest, and one's the father-in-law of the other. But Caiaphas this year is the high priest officially, and he says, "You know nothing at all." So they're bickering and discussing this, and he says, "You know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not." Now I'm going to read the next verse so you can understand what's going on here. "This spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation." Now Caiaphas' logic was, we got to get this man and kill him so that our nation's not punished by the Romans. Or you might say, that might be his outward professed desire, but inwardly, this man has to die so we don't lose our religious influence, and we don't lose all of our followers, you might say. It's expedient that this one man should die for all the others, so that the whole nation perish not, either to be led astray or to be taken over by the Romans, because that's what they'd said back in verse 48, "The Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." And really, to be honest, these men are more worried about losing their place than their nation. I think that's probably pretty obvious, although some of them might have been patriotic just in the natural sense. But this is something that Caiaphas said, because, but like I said, it has a dual meaning, but the hidden meaning is very prophetic. He prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. Now, just like he does many other times, John the Beloved gives us a little background here, a little commentary. He says, and that's part of it, verse 51, "This spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation, and not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad." So all of you Pharisees and priests on the council, Caiaphas says, you don't know anything. It's expedient for us, and this is a prophetic statement, it's expedient for us that one man should die for the people, that the whole nation perish not. So the prophetic part of that is that there is one man that's going to die for the people, and not just for that nation, not just for his people in that nation, but also that he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. So there's a couple of ways you can look at this. He is maybe perhaps talking about dying for that nation so the Romans don't come and take them out, remove them from their place and nation. Die for that nation, and die for the people of God in that nation. That could be it as well. But also that he would die for and gather in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. Then from that day forth they took counsel together for to put him to death. This is the intention of the Lord, to lay down his life. And it is expedient for his people, necessary for his people, that he would lay down his life. Caiaphas is right about that. But it doesn't remove the guilt from the hands of those that would take him and slay him. In fact, given the fact that Caiaphas prophesied there, and given the fact that the Lord gave him this little bit of knowledge, I think he's doubly damned if he continued in this attitude of seeking the Lord's death, and he never repented of such a terrible deed. Given his place and position that we've already talked about in the nation of Israel, he should have been leading them to the Christ, not destroying the Christ. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence into a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples. So he's leaving Judea again, just like he did a couple of chapters before. Remember back in chapter number 10, when they sought to take him. he went beyond Jordan and left Judea, and then he came back. And remember, even, was it Thomas or Philip said that let's go with him? It was Thomas back in verse 16 of chapter number 11. It's like he made a trip back into Judea, did another tremendous miracle, and then they reject him, and he leaves once more. Again, not out of fear, but just out of, this is his plan. This is what this is the purpose of God. And he didn't walk openly amongst the Jews. And the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand, and many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. So this is drawing nigh now to the time when the Lord would lay down his life. The Passover is near. Lots of folks are passing to and fro, heading to Jerusalem. Then sought they for Jesus, and spake among themselves as they stood in the temple, what think ye, that he will not come to the feast? Now this isn't the first time they've asked this. They've asked this at other Passovers as well, I believe. Is he bold enough, is he daring enough to come? Will he come to this feast? Well, he's going to do it, and there's going to be even more that takes place at this particular feast. Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment, and if any man knew where he were, he should show it, that they might take him. Now previously, the commandment was that if any man confessed him to be the Christ, he'd be put out of the synagogue. Now, if you even know where he is, you were required to let the authorities know. This is how bad the enmity has gotten, and the hatred has, this is how bad the hatred is now as far as the Jews, or at least the leaders of the Jews, towards the Lord Jesus Christ. All right, so we'll stop right there for now, and then hopefully next time we'll start